Hello and welcome to my talk on an empirical study of service mesh traffic management policies for microservices. I'm Mohammad Reza, and this work is done by Christian Klein, Johan Torchon, and me at the Department of Computing Science at Umeå University in Sweden. But before we deep dive into the empirical study, let's take a look at some concepts. The first one is microservice. Microservice is an architectural style that structures an application as a collection of distributed services with multiple instances that function as cohesive and independent processes interacting via messages. These services are highly maintainable and testable, they are loosely coupled and independently deployable, and most of the time they are owned by a small team in industry. But microservice could add some challenges because its performance depends on the implemented functionality and the incoming workload. An increasing load may cause violation of a service level objective. Therefore, the inter-service communication and traffic management mechanisms used in such dynamic environments are so complex. Also, a failure in deeper layers of a service chain can be propagated to all other layers of service chain. Service meshes were introduced to handle this complexity and prevent the propagation of the failures. It can also facilitate management, observability, and communication between microservices. But what is a service mesh in essence? A service mesh is an infrastructure layer built directly into the microservices as a set of configurable proxies. This allows the network to be completely abstracted, providing a single point of network interaction for each service. A service mesh provides a range of traffic management policies such as circuit breaking and retry mechanisms, which are claimed to make application more robust and resilient toward failures of dependent services or the network. In a previous study, we learned that circuit breaking rejects incoming requests to protect latency at the expense of availability, enabling fast reactions to overloads and load spikes. On the other hand, retry mechanism is the procedure of retrying the failed requests. In a service mesh, both circuit breakers and retry mechanisms are configured on the called services. So, how did we start? We observed that despite the considerable interest in circuit breaking, retry mechanisms, and their potential benefit for microservice robustness and performance, there is a lack of systematic studies on how effective these policies and their control parameters actually are for a resilient and robust service mesh. To clarify the impact of traffic management policies based on circuit breakers and retry mechanisms, as well as the effects of varying the parameter settings of these tools, we defined 3 research questions and tried to answer them all. To perform the empirical study, we needed some sample applications, and we used a snowball sampling to find applications satisfying the predefined technical conditions, and finally, Online Boutique, previously known as Hipster Shop, is selected. This application consists of 11 microservices and is a web-based e-commerce app. We chose to focus on one of the application's 11 endpoints, which invokes a chain of 3 microservices. Upon invoking this endpoint, a total of 6 internal requests are required to deliver a successful and complete response. Now let's talk about our approach. To collect data for our study, we developed a configuration manager that repeatedly configures traffic management policies for selected and deployed application in Istio as a service mesh. Then we ran the traffic generator to generate an open loop workload, and during the execution of traffic generator, the response times and responses of all services were monitored. Then we manually identified 3 key traffic management parameters in Istio. The first one is HTTP max request, which is the size of the queue in the circuit breakers configuration. And there are 2 other parameters for the retry mechanism. The first one is attempts, which specifies the maximum number of times that the sidecar proxy attempts to connect to a service if the initial call fails. Then per try timeout, which specifies the interval between retries when attempting to connect to a service. And then generally this study contains 6 different dimensions. There is 3 different scenarios for circuit breaker configuration, retry attempts, retry intervals, incoming traffic, and load spikes, and 4 other scenarios for enforcement point of circuit breaker or retry mechanism. We studied all possible combinations of these dimensions. During this study, we performed thousands of experiments, but we discussed 320 of them. Each experiment took 5 minutes to complete, and more than 110 million requests were generated for the discussing experiments, and they took more than 130 hours. And finally, to analyze the results of each configuration of traffic management in the service mesh, we plot frequency of each response type over time and cumulative distribution functions or CDFs of the response time for all requests and carried throughput as well. Now let's talk about the results. To study the impact of varying the circuit breaker enforcement point, we conducted a set of experiments in which the emulated workload was 1.2 times of capacity and the circuit breaker threshold was set to 20, while varying the application tier on which the circuit breaker acted on. In the left chart, you can see different enforcement point of circuit breaker in each row, and also the response types for different tiers are shown in different columns. The successful requests are shown with green lines, circuit breaker with orange lines, and failed requests with red lines. As you can see, the pattern of failed requests in first tier follows the pattern of circuit breaker requests on third tier. Also, in the right chart, you can see the CDF chart of response times. The response times of all requests are highlighted with a triangle marker, and the response times of successful requests, known as a carried throughput, are highlighted with a circle marker. Also, response times for all tiers are separated with different color. But what we actually have learned from these experiments? Based on the results, we learned that if the circuit breaker acts on the first tier, it prevents downstream tiers from consuming resources on overloading requests, and the response time is lower than for enforcement on the second or third tier. Conversely, if the circuit breaker acts on the second or third tier, some requests are rejected after traversing a few tiers. This means that although the result is the same from the external client's perspective, but more resources are consumed than when the circuit breaker acts on the first tier. To investigate the impact of varying the incoming traffic volume, we performed a series of experiments in which the emulated workload was varied between 0.8 times of capacity and 1.2 times of capacity. In this case, we limited the circuit breaker threshold to 20 on the first tier. For the sake of time, let's skip the chart presentation and just discuss what we have learned. It was clear that the volume of incoming traffic directly influenced the frequency of unsuccessful requests. Although the rate of successful requests was higher when the incoming traffic volume was 1.2 times of capacity, higher incoming traffic volumes led to higher frequency of unsuccessful requests. Additionally, we found that fast failure helped the system to maintain an acceptable response time. What about different circuit breaker thresholds? To study the impact of circuit breaker threshold, we performed a series of experiments in which the threshold was varied between 1, 20, and 1024 for the first tier, and in this case we limited the emulated workload to 1.2 times of capacity. We observed that there is a trade-off between the maximum request rate and the response time. A high circuit breaker threshold allows more requests to pass through, but also increases response time. In contrast, a low circuit breaker threshold reduces response time, but also reduces the request rate. The circuit breaker threshold used in the previous experiments, 20, was found to provide a good balance between these two factors. To analyze the interaction between retry mechanisms and circuit breaker patterns, we present a subset of experiments in which the incoming traffic volume was fixed at 100% of capacity, the retry mechanism was configured to permit only a single retry, and the circuit breaker acted on the third tier, with varying the circuit breaker thresholds. If the circuit breaker threshold is too short, or there are failures in the call service with the retry mechanism active, we can expect a series of requests that are retried from caller service. If the circuit breaker threshold is high, the response time increases, which is consistent with the previously discussed experiments without the retry mechanism. We also discussed similar results in our previous work. There is a trade-off between response time and carried throughput, to be handled per preference of the system administrator. The main difference between the cases with and without the retry mechanism is that including the retry mechanism increases the response time further. A key parameter controlling a retry mechanism is the number of permitted retries. To study the impact of varying this parameter, we performed a series of experiments in which the incoming traffic was fixed at 100% of capacity and the circuit breaker's threshold was set to 1 to maximize the impact of retry attempts, with different number of retry attempts on the third tier. We observed that increasing the number of permitted retries slightly increased the number of successful and circuit breaker requests and response time, while reducing the number of failed requests. Additionally, when the number of permitted retries was set to 0, under these conditions, there were fewer successful and circuit breaker requests and more failed requests than when a single retry was allowed. Another retry mechanism parameter that can be varied is the interval between retries. To investigate the impact of varying the retry interval, we present a subset of experiments in which the retry interval was varied with the incoming traffic volume fixed at 100% of capacity and the circuit breaker threshold set to 20, with 10 retry attempts. In these experiments, both the retry mechanism and the circuit breaker were active on the third tier only. Based on the results, we observed that if the retry interval was too short, the frequency of circuit breaker requests increased slightly. But the relative magnitude of this change in the retry interval was substantially greater than the relative magnitude of the change in the frequencies of each request type. We thus conclude that the retry interval does not greatly affect performance. Additionally, varying the retry interval did not greatly affect the response time as well. To study the impact of load spikes and different retry intervals, we performed a series of experiments in which the incoming traffic was set at 100% of capacity most of the time, spiking to 1.2 times of capacity for 5 seconds at 60 seconds interval. In these experiments, the circuit breaker threshold was set to 20, and the number of permitted retry attempts was set to 10 while varying the retry interval. Both the retry mechanism and the circuit breaker acted on the third tier. We observed that if the retry interval is too short, the frequency of circuit breaker requests after a spike is slightly increased. The response times for the workload with the spikes are similar to those seen in previous experiments. We next compared the impact of varying the magnitude of spikes in the incoming workload. In these experiments, the incoming traffic volume was mostly set to 100% of system's capacity while the spike volume was varied. The circuit breaker threshold was set to 20 and 10 retries were permitted while varying the retry interval on the third tier. The results obtained were similar to those observed when simply varying the retry interval. Varying the spike volume caused the frequency of failed requests to increase at the same rate as the first tier spike volume. Varying the magnitude of the workload spikes also had little effect on the response times. The pattern observed was similar to that seen in previous experiments. Finally, to study the impact of varying the enforcement point of the retry mechanism and circuit breaker, we conducted a series of experiments with a circuit breaker threshold of 20, 2 permitted retry attempts, and a 5-second retry interval, while varying the tier on which the circuit breaker and retry mechanism acted. A workload equal to 100% of system capacity was imposed in all cases. We learned that when the circuit breaker was set to act on the first tier, the results obtained for both response types and response times in this case were identical for all retry mechanism configurations. Conversely, if the circuit breaker was set to act on the second tier, the use of the retry mechanism caused some increase in failed requests and response times when it was set to act on all possible tiers. When circuit breaker was set to act on third tier, the frequency of failed requests was highest, and the response times are also increased when the retry mechanism was configured to act on the first tier or on all tiers. Now let's discuss the results. The first research question asks about how should circuit breakers be configured. Our experiments show that a well-configured circuit breaker can maintain a favorable response time while maximizing the application throughput. Circuit breakers enable fast failures and prevent clients from repeatedly trying to connect to an overloaded or failing service. Circuit breakers can also enhance the user experience. To summarize, we found that configuring circuit breakers to act on lower application layers improve the user experience. Finally, we conclude that circuit breakers are useful in the case of a transient failure or overload. The second research question asks about how should the retry mechanism be configured. Based on our experiments, if a sensitive circuit breaker is used, the simultaneous use of a retry mechanism may lead to a retry storm, which is expected. If the circuit breaker is not properly configured, a retry mechanism may surprisingly increase the throughput during load spikes. We also learned that a high number of retry attempts is unhelpful and may diminish the user experience by increasing the response time. The same is true for a high retry interval, while an overly short retry interval may worsen overloads or failures. We conclude that retry mechanisms are useful only for managing transient failures or overload situations. Finally, the third and last research question asks about how do workload characteristics impact the answers to the first two research questions. Based on the results of our experiments, overload is inevitable if the incoming traffic volume exceeds the capacity of the resources. During a transient overload, a circuit breaker can enable fast failure, which improves the user experience. We also conclude that load spikes can be controlled by using proper circuit breaker configuration in conjunction with a small number of permitted retry attempts with a retry interval that is neither too low nor too high. We believe that if the overload situation is not transient, then the circuit breaker pattern and retry mechanisms are not good choices for maintaining an acceptable user experience. This paper studies service mesh traffic management policies for microservices to provide guidance on the practical use of these policies and to show how they can increase application performance and resiliency. As microservice performance depends on many factors, configuring traffic management policies can be challenging. The service mesh landscape is also rapidly evolving, and some features available in proxy sidecars cannot be controlled through the service mesh control plane. Also, the use of service mesh enables outstanding observability without imposing any particular implementation cost during the development process, which suggests that it may be beneficial to develop methods for autonomous control of the service mesh. So we are going to develop a controller to manage service mesh in my next step in research, and that's all. Thank you for listening.